Hello and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. We have a reputation for emphasising the importance of the trade unions in struggles from workplace issues like pay and conditions to social issues like the NHS and racism. But right-wing union leaderships have often meant that in the recent period, the trade unions haven't always been at the cutting edge of struggle. So why do they still matter? And what can be done to force them to use their potential power? This week, we're asking, what's the big deal about trade unions? Over to Sarah Rack.
Today I'm here with Rob Williams, who is the National Industrial Organiser of the Socialist Party. Hi Rob.
Hiya.
And we're going to be talking about the trade unions. So if we jump straight in then to the issue at the heart of it, I think. Obviously the Socialist Party, we say we're a revolutionary party. We strive to completely transform the way that the world is organised for revolutionary change. And to put it mildly, at the moment anyway, the trade unions are not that type of body. They're not revolutionary organisations. But I think the Socialist Party has a reputation actually for putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of the trade unions. Why is that? Why do we care so much about the unions, given that?
Yeah, well, first of all, because the trade unions are the basic organisation of workers, and you're right in saying that at the moment it can look like perhaps they're not playing the role that they should do, although we should make the point that, you know, and I'm also chair of the National Shop Stewards Network, and if people follow what we put out every week in the NSSN, that the unions are still involved in a huge amount of activity and disputes, members taking action, but on the whole, then it's true to say that many of the unions are not playing the role they should do, but nevertheless they have massive potential. You know, the working class is the dominant class in society. The trade unions have 6 million members. To put that into perspective, you know, the Labour Party has had a big influx of members over the last few years since Jeremy Corbyn was elected, but the unions are over 10 times as big. You know, they're the biggest organisation in society. Unfortunately, not perhaps as big as they were in a period. There's reasons for that, and perhaps we'll go into them. But nevertheless, they've got huge potential. And from time to time, we've seen that potential, if not being realised fully, at least hinted at. Certainly the pension strikes, public sector pension strikes of 2011, where 2 million workers took action, had a massive effect as well. And for us, the key thing is how can we have an influence on the unions and make them play the role that we think they could have in organising workers, but challenging this system that is really attacking workers on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's what we always try to get across to people, isn't it? We're talking about the potential of the unions, and really when people say the Socialist Party has a reputation for putting emphasis on the unions, I think what it really demonstrates is that the Socialist Party has a reputation for putting the emphasis on the working class and, you know, having a big faith in the power of the working class to change things, and the trade unions being bodies that represent the organisation of that power. And that it's not necessarily about what those bodies are like at the moment, but like you say, the potential that's in them. And we don't just, obviously there's all the workplace issues at the moment, there's all the campaigns on pay and you know, there's a direct threat to jobs and that kind of thing when we say the trade unions should take a lead on those workplace issues. But we also, when any kind of, you know, social struggle comes up, we also say that we should take that into the trade unions. So on the issue of women's rights, for example, we led the campaign against domestic violence in the past, which was taking the issue of domestic violence into the unions. At the moment, with the Football Lads Alliance and the threat from the far right, we've written a trade union motion trying to get the unions to take a lead on organising on that issue, on the issue of housing and all kinds of other things that people might not think automatically are trade union issues. We still always emphasise taking that into the trade union. So, but some people might ask, what have those things got to do with the trade unions?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, obviously it's not just an issue of the trade unions as such. To us, the trade unions is the organisation of workers, but of course, unfortunately, we live in an era where trade union density is at a low level compared to what it was. So therefore, it's also the workplaces. Now, why is that important that workers take the lead in that, and of course ultimately the unions itself? Well, for instance, on the issue of racism, where when you're in a workplace, that's the everyday environment that you're involved in. And of course, for us, the reason why workers, we don't have this romantic view of workers. For us, the reason why the working class is so important is because they ultimately have the economic power, that can have a direct impact if they take action together and collectively on capitalism as a whole. In effect, workers make the profits. If workers make the trains run, they make the electricity flow. If they take action in that way, they can stop capitalism, and that's important. But also, it's the fact that workers are more prone to have a collective consciousness, because they work together. They're involved in production, but not just production. Obviously, other aspects of work together, and that is what marks them out differently. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have workers with contrary views. Let's be clear. There'll be people who are on the Football Lads Alliance demonstrations, I believe, are being exploited by those ideas. But the idea that some of those are not workers, we'd be kidding ourselves in that way. But also, if they are workers, and even if they're involved in the unions, that means the unions have a real opportunity to make those, points to them. And the reason why I think it's important is like in London, but not just in London, in all over the country, increasingly we have a diverse workforce. So, for instance, when the London bus workers were on strike, and they've been on strike a few times over the last few years, we have a workforce of 25,000-30,000 workers from many, many different countries, different ethnic backgrounds, etc. But of course, they were on the picket lines together. They were on strike together. And that was showing to those workers in practice, even those who were a bit prone to racist ideas and sympathies. But what that was showing to them was that if workers take action together, if they stand together, then that's when they can gain. If they divided, then that only helps the employer. And we have to get that point over to them as well. I think there's another aspect as well, is that, just on the issue as well of other issues, issues about sexism, homophobia, etc. Again, it's this idea that if workers are united, then, those ideas of division, whether they be race, gender, homophobia or whatever, then they only help the employer. A divided workforce is one where the boss is going to be strengthened. I think there's another issue as well. The reason why we need to take these in the unions is because, we need to put demands on the union leaders, because otherwise they could be left off the hook. The union leaders are quite happy to outsource, some of the union leaders rather, we don't want to put them all in the same bunch, but some union leaders would be quite happy to outsource some of these struggles. So, for instance, whether it be the fight against the racists and the fascists, some of the other issues. I mean, for example, we don't want to get in a situation where we've had, for instance, over the last period, the People's Assembly, for instance, which has huge amount of trade union backing and finance. The unions, for us, should be at the fore of fighting austerity. They don't need to create an organisation to do that. And of course, the reason for us is simple. If the trade unions take the action, if the trade unions organise the demonstration, then what it means is that workers going on those demonstrations can put demands on the unions for the next course of action, whether it needs to take strike action to develop the action that's needed. If you outsource it, then the unions are like a guest at that, and that is not, in our opinion, the best way to organise it. Of course, if the union leaders aren't prepared to take an action, then of course, rank and file organisations, the NSSN is part of this, other organisations, we are prepared to take a lead if we have to. But when the National Shop Stewards Network takes action, it doesn't take action and says, this is what we want to do. It says, actually, the unions should be doing this, and we are taking action to put the pressure and the demands on the unions to take the action that they should be doing anyway.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of that is it's about how do the trade unions convince workers that the trade unions are the bodies that are going to fight for them, with them, and so on. Because at the moment there's a big number of people who are, have some fears, but also a lot of anger, and are getting active on a lot of different issues, not just immediate workplace issues, but things such as the fight against racism and sexism and so on. And if the trade unions don't appear to show any interest in those types of things, it further alienates them from working class people, and particularly from young workers who are getting kind of radicalised on these types of issues. But obviously, I mean, we've already referenced a bit that they don't go along with the demands that we're putting forward on them to take a lead in any type of struggle. And actually, it's a bit of a international phenomena, isn't it? That in the period since the economic crisis and austerity and so on, that the trade unions' role has not been, in general, one of leading things, pushing things forward, leading the labour movement to have big successes against austerity. And in some places, the trade unions have played completely the opposite to that role. So, is it possible to change that, to turn that around, for the trade unions to be playing the kind of role that we think they can? And I think, we'd say for that to happen, workers have to take a lead, isn't it? Workers have to struggle to change them. But how can workers be convinced to do that, given how much they've been holding things back?
Well, first of all, the reason why, when you think about it, the reason why it's important the unions take a lead on these issues is because they can be quite divisive in the wrong hands. And I think the unions can play a fundamental role in uniting those issues. Again, we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't think there is layers of workers who can be attracted to some of these reactionary ideas, again, whether it's racism, sexism, etc. Whereas the unions can play a unique role almost in bringing those together. When that doesn't happen, then of course we can get into a situation of quite polarised issues. We've seen that, haven't we? On the issue of the Gender Recognition Act, where we have different forces out there, all of whom probably would regard themselves as progressive or, perhaps even of the left, and you can easily get into a situation where you're fighting each other. So I think the unions play a fundamental role in that, in being able to unite people. But of course, these are debates that are out there. And yes, can unions be transformed? Well, I think unions, can be transformed. And really, what we advocate is people who do want to change their union, getting together. We've always had a view in the Socialist Party that it's possible to bring together people who regard themselves as fighters into different left organisations. We might not agree with every single thing that each of us stand for, but I'm sure agree that a particular union has to be transformed. For instance, that is the role we historically played in CPSA and now PCS. We're involved in unison action, in unison at the moment, against the Prentice leadership. And again, he's over the last day or so, he's, in our opinion, joining the anti-Jeremy Corbyn bandwagon. So, and we are involved in those organisations with people and parties who don't necessarily agree with everything that we stand for or we put forward, but we can work on a practical basis, and those have to be built up. Those rank and file left organisations, or broad lefts as they were traditionally known, that we should do that. But also, of course, it's about organising the rank and file. One of the tremendous movements that took place over the last 7-8 years really was the construction workers who were mobilised against the Besner contract in 2011, 2012. They were going to lose up to 35% of their wages. They were trying to put pressure on their union to fight that. But what they did was they then organised as a rank and file level and acted as a lever, as a pressure on Unite at the time. And then Unite came in, supported the struggle, and they've tried to retain that rank and file structure as well. So it is possible. And of course, there might be people listening to this who've never heard some of these things before. And of course, that is an aspect of what we have to do as well. We have to tell people what's happening. And of course, we have to be the memory of the working class. When I referred earlier to the 2011 pension strike, which was the high point probably of the last period in Britain. Earlier that year, 750,000 workers marched on an anti-austerity demonstration against the Tories. Later that year, we had the pensions strike. Fantastic movements that could and should have, really defeated what was the condemned coalition. But some of the trade union leaders, couldn't wait to get out of that dispute. And that has had massive consequences. That has meant the Tories have felt emboldened to really roll out their austerity offensive. But nevertheless, that did show us that workers can take action. But of course, if we don't remind people that happened, how many people remember that November 30th, 2011 wasn't just a strike of 2 million workers, it was a mobilisation. 60,000 people marched in London, 30,000 in Manchester, 20,000 in Brighton and Bristol, and I think 4,000 people marched in Taunton. Now, I've got nothing against people. It's probably not the most capital of the organised working class, but it just showed you that actually did happen, and we have to remind people of that and show what the potential is. And there's no doubt, in my opinion, that underneath the surface there is a massive anger exists in society. That's reflected in support for Jeremy Corbyn. That's reflected in the Scottish independence referendum. I think the EU referendum as well. There's massive anger. We see on a localised basis loads of disputes that take place all the time. If that can be mobilised, coordinated, then the working class can be a decisive force in society.
So then, I suppose some of the things that some people would put forward now, who kind of see themselves as the kind of modern thinkers of the left, if you like, who might say that the trade unions are less relevant today because things have objectively changed in how work is organised in particular. So, the rise of 0-hour contracts, the number of people who are, working a number of different jobs, who are using apps to get their work and that kind of thing, that changes the nature of work and therefore the way that workers are going to organise. What do you think about that? Do you think that that those changes do change the way that people have to organise? Does it make it harder for the way that unions have been established? Was that for a different type of work which doesn't necessarily work for kind of modern employment structures? And then related to that, they have, I'm sure you'll now say about some of the struggles there have been with Deliveroo and so on of some of these different types of workers. And do you think there is a prospect for a kind of a new unionism?
Well, I mean, it's worth saying to listeners that new unionism, that concept, took place in the late 19th century, and it pertains to the building of the general unions at the time. Because if you think about it, the reason why they call trade unions is because historically they were for skilled workers, and there was actually resistance on behalf of some of those unions to the idea that unskilled workers or semi-skilled workers should be allowed to join unions. But of course, it's really that helped unions become mass organisations, and what that shows is that there's always been challenges facing the unions. Of course, the objective situation will challenge unions, because suddenly what you don't have as much perhaps is, if you look back 30, 40 years ago, I think 40 odd years ago, there were 6.5 million workers in manufacturing industry. There's less than 3 million now. You don't have necessarily the big, massive workplaces. We do have some of them, but we don't have them on the same scale as we had in the past. So yes, of course, but of course we had those challenges before. We had dockers turning up to work where they'd all have to have a mad scrum to see who got that day's work, or who would be the blue-eyed boy and would get that work. Anyone who worked in the 19th century, you could argue they were always on day-to-day contracts, if their face didn't fit, or the security of work. So unions have always had to fight that. But of course, capitalism is regressing. Capitalism is going back to Victorian times, and the unions have to deal with that. And there have been some positive signs. The unions are trying to grapple with it. For instance, we're going to have the 5th strike coming up in the next week or so by workers in TGI Fridays who are organised in Unite. Probably never heard of a trade union previously. But again, workers in very insecure, precarious work. You mentioned Deliveroo, Uber Eats. We've seen a few of these courier companies, unions starting to look towards them. We saw the McDonald's workers, etc. So the unions are starting to organise in these sectors and trying to grapple with them. And of course, the unions have been written off many times. But we have to have a sense of proportion here. I think there are something like 30 million workers in Britain. There is a massive field to recruit workers into the unions. But of course, as work, it's this contradiction, isn't it? The more precarious work becomes, the more reason you've got to join a trade union. However, it does set some practical obstacles in doing that. But nevertheless, the unions have to continue to look to that. And there's no shortcut. The way you recruit workers into a trade union is by showing them the difference the trade union makes. You have to win victories. So, for instance, the McDonald's workers who are still in dispute with McDonald's, and we in the Bakers Union, we expect them to be on strike again, but they've already had some localised victories. They've had some victories in terms of terms and conditions, dealing with bullying management, and ultimately that is what builds a union, bringing home the lesson that if you're organised, you stand together, then you can win. I mean, the Deliveroo workers, we were told initially that the gig economy, it's moved on. You don't have employers, you don't have workers anymore. Well, it doesn't matter what you call a worker. You might call them an independent contractor. You may call the employer a different name, but the fact was that dispute was a dispute, and it was clear to all those all those workers that they were the workers, and management were management, and it looked and felt like a normal dispute, and that's exactly what it was. And what it did do, it brought in a whole new layer of workers. See, the other thing we need to make is the attraction of unions. There's a number of processes going on, I think, in the workforce at the moment. That yes, we're dealing with one year about work becoming precarious, but on the other hand, what we're having is big sections of what previously you'd regard as middle class people being drawn into the labour and trade union movement. I mean, the most obvious example of that probably was the junior doctors a couple of years ago, with fantastic picket lines, and see, the thing is, when workers take action, their consciousness changes. Those workers, that's what they are, learned quickly through that dispute. The other example this year is the university lecturers and other workers, postgrads and all the rest of it, took part in an incredible dispute this year. They not only took on the employer, who was yet again coming after their pensions, they also organised to prevent the union from stopping that dispute prematurely. It was incredible, 600 lecturers outside the UCU headquarters in London to maintain the dispute. There were some younger members of the union who were there who probably didn't have the pension in the pension scheme, but realised this dispute was key for their whole livelihood in education, the attacks that have been rolled out against them, etc. So, again, those examples show you what is possible, and not just what is possible, but what is happening. But of course, it's beholden on us to shout from the rooftops, and the unions themselves, this is the practical example of what is possible if you organise together.
Yeah, and I think also it shows, it really emphasises the correctness of what we've always said, isn't it? That we've continued to maintain an emphasis on the trade unions, even when they've not played a good role, because it shows that there is a certain instinctive thing about it, that when workers need to fight back, and all workers do need to fight back, and, are pushed to that at a certain point, that they almost naturally turn to the traditional methods of the trade unions, of strike action, of mass meetings and so on. Those things have been thrown up in all those different disputes. So another aspect then of things at the moment is the political side of things, which I think has an impact in the trade unions as well. So what do you think has been the impact of the kind of surges behind Corbyn in the trade unions and in the workplace struggles? Because obviously you might, on the one hand, there's the fact that people are feeling confident that things can be a different way, but it's not just been a straightforward thing like that, isn't it? It's not that since Corbyn's come to power in the Labour Party, there's just been a huge number of extra struggles that are being led much more militantly. It's not a clear thing like that.
I think it's contradictory, as you say. I think in general we would say that the development around Jeremy Corbyn has been really positive, in the sense that far more people are talking about socialist ideas, and to get the leader of the Labour Party, the word socialism being talked about, at least a programme against privatisation, for nationalisation, public ownership, and of course a Labour leader who's not embarrassed to stand on a picket line, again, is enormously progressive, and undoubtedly that has given a layer of the activists confidence that change is possible, if you like. It's in the air, and that is very positive. But I agree, there's also a contradictory side to that, and that is that there can be a tendency to be to passivity. The idea that we don't need to do what needs to be done, we don't need to organise, we don't need to take action because a Jeremy Corbyn government is just around the corner. Well, that's far from certain. Anyone who looks at what I would call the fake news of this offensive against Corbyn on anti-Semitism will realise that has been coordinated. As soon as Theresa May is on the back step, she's under attack. The Tory splits get to a certain pitch. Lo and behold, the loyal Blairites, i.e. loyal to the capitalist establishment, come out and go on about anti-Semitism. And what does that reveal? It reveals the powers that be are determined that there shouldn't be a Corbyn government, and they're prepared to do what it takes. Or should there be a Corbyn government, they will put relentless pressure on him not to implement his programme. And I think that's because they're terrified, as much as what that can do to workers, that the expectation that can raise amongst workers. I give an example, for instance. My local town, Talbot, where the steelworks 2 years ago were on the verge of closing. There's no question about that, in my opinion. If Corbyn was Prime Minister, would you have steelworkers demanding that be brought into public ownership? Similarly with London bus drivers, or train drivers, or etc. So that's what they're terrified. They're terrified about the expectation that will be created. It's no way guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in this period. And actually, the role the unions can play is not just about taking action that's needed, on a day-to-day basis to improve their pay and conditions, stop job losses, etc. The unions also have a key role to play, one, in getting Corbyn elected, but two, what could happen after Corbyn is elected as well. Because, if we look at what happened in Greece with the Syriza government, the left government, it was put under relentless pressure by the European Union, also the Greek capitalists. And the same will happen with Corbyn. There'll be huge pressure put on Corbyn to retreat from his programme, and the organised working class can have a massive will play the key role in fighting against that pressure and keeping the pressure on Corbyn to carry out his programme. And it is not in the interests of the working class to be lulled to sleep, if you like, to just wait for a Corbyn government. The truth is, we have to fight on the day-to-day issues. We have to link them to getting rid of the Tories, but also bringing in a government that actually can change things. And that means confronting the very capitalist establishment, the employers that are trying to sabotage Corbyn's government in alliance with the Blairites. So the working class organised together on the front foot is necessary now, in the run-up to a possible Corbyn government and after a Corbyn government.
Okay, so, and obviously that those kind of political points are one of the big things that we're raising inside the trade unions at the moment. And you've mentioned the role of the union left organisations that we've kind of helped build in a number of unions. What are the other kind of key tasks for Marxists in the trade unions at the moment, and particularly the Socialist Party? What are the kind of key things for us to be thinking about?
Well, first of all, I think if you look at the unions as they stand, then obviously what we have at the moment is we have the continuing austerity offensive, particularly in the public sector. We've had some possible fights on pay, some actual fights on pay, but unfortunately the PCS hasn't been able to get the necessary threshold of votes to give them a legal dispute against the employer. I mean, it's worth reflecting, we haven't mentioned that, by the way, but the Trade Union Act that came into law just over a year ago, totally undemocratic. The trade unions now are the only organisation in society where a simple majority is not allowed, is enough for them. Although we have a government that didn't even win a majority, probably God knows how much turnout it had in the election, and yet posed this undemocratic law on people. And the reality is the trade unions collectively didn't do enough on that. The TUC didn't call one demonstration. I think they called one lobby of Parliament, didn't call one demonstration against it. But I'm confident that in the period that lies ahead, when workers take action, if the issue is important enough, they're not going to be constrained and restricted by such an undemocratic Tory law. But it does mean, however, that those tasks are still on the order of the day as far as pay is concerned. There's going to be a debate in the teaching unions going into the autumn about the action they need to take on pay. In education, there's more action to be discussed and hopefully put forward. And the issue isn't going to go away in the civil service unions, local government unions. In the NHS, by the way, there's a controversy because health workers were expecting more money in their pay packets from what the leadership told them, and that is certainly controversial, and that may come back as well. But I think the key issue, as far as public sector unions together, they're still working together, fighting together. It's the 150th anniversary of the TUC this year. It's I think most workers would probably think it's got a checkered history, but of course that history, the history of the unions, is one of tremendous moments, tremendous periods where the unions have been a mighty force in society for the good of workers, that have improved workers' life, have been the motor force behind that. But of course there have been other not so good moments, and really the factors is that when the trade union members are mobilised and are organised to act in the trade unions, to put pressure on the leadership if necessary to take the action that's needed, then that is the most positive work that can be done, really. And that's when the unions take the best action, and we always need that. We always need the pressure of rank and file workers on the leadership as a critical mass to push them to take the action that is necessary. And again, as I've said, we've seen glimpses of that in the last period. I go back to November 30th, 2011. That was the biggest action taken by workers probably since the height of the winter of discontent. There were more workers out on November the 30th than any day in the general strike in 1926. And what we have to do is continually fight for the action that is needed against what is a weak and divided Tory government, a government that is racked by crisis, and a working class that is angry. The question is, how can we channel that anger together to put this government under the pressure that hopefully can push them out of office? And that's a good point to make here, that Jeremy Corbyn, we hope, comes to office, if you like. But if Jeremy Corbyn comes to office on the back of the Tories being really put under the maximum pressure by workers, in effect putting them under pressure that means that a general election has been called, in effect the organised working class pushing out the Tories, it means a totally different character to that government. It means the working class is going on record, is registering that they are the dominant force in society, and they are a check on that government as well. And it's a warning then to the capitalist establishment. That's why we have to fight on the day-to-day issues that affect workers, on pay, terms and conditions, pensions, jobs, etc. And of course the issues you raise on that affect workers, like sexism, racism, etc. But the working class mobilised together can be, the powerful force in society, and we have to fight for that force to have ideas, revolutionary ideas, socialist ideas, to understand the need to change society overall.
Okay, I think that's a good note to finish on in terms of why it's important for us all to study these kind of issues and try our best to understand what's at the heart of them. So thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Rob gave an outline there of the basics of how we approach the trade unions, but there are many more issues to discuss. Let us know your questions or which topics you'd like us to go into more detail on by emailing socialismpodcast@socialistparty.org.uk. And a great way to continue the discussion is to attend Socialism 2018 this weekend, the 10th and 11th of November in central London. Workshops include Can the Unions Fight Austerity and PCS Union Assistant General Secretary Election, The Real Issues. See full details and get your ticket at socialism2018.net. There's also suggested further reading on the topic in the episode notes at socialistparty.org.uk/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on your podcast app to never miss an episode.